So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for accepting. It is for me a great pleasure to be here and to go forward with our discussions about waste, ecological issues, and so on. What I will talk, it may seem that it is something like a shift in theme, and we are going to talk not about those who are going to extinct, but about those who are going to throw something away, and about remnants of a human's activity. But for me, it's also about humanism, but in the aspect of waste. The focus of my talk is on waste in the Anthropocene. It is evident that Anthropocene as a geological event and as an event of self-awareness has changed our relationship to waste. The atmosphere of crisis and danger changes the context of evaluation of consumption and waste. For its part, waste is very important for the identification of a new geological epoch. So we can ask how the Anthropocene determines the interpretation of waste and how waste determines the interpretation of the Anthropocene. From the outset, I have to say that I find the concept of the Anthropocene very problematic. On the one hand, we need to say that we need an appropriate term to name a new situation, to name a global changes. Terms like globalization and modernity have exhausted their possibilities, and now we see how these terms were anthropocentric and based on human exceptionalism. The Anthropocene as a term of neutral geology and not of anthropocentric humanities seems very promising. It questions the great divisions between culture and nature, between humans and animals in general. The Anthropocene offers new perspective for new questions. On the other hand, critics of the term show that the Anthropocene, in one way or another, reanimates the anthropological difference between human and animal. It reanimates human exceptionalism by dividing humans as the most important creature that has become a geological force. Proponents of the Capitalocene, for example, argue that the Anthropocene treats humans to generally and hides those who are really guilty of our predicament. Others think that we need another narrative to live in the Cthulhucene in trouble with a new kinships. So I understand the problem, and I take this term not as very adequate to identify and articulate the peculiarity of our epoch, but as a question, as an indication of a new situation where the framing of the question of human has changed, and that we have to ask it in a different way. For someone like me, who interprets from a phenological and hermeneutic point of view, it is very interesting that most discourses speak in the name of we humans, but who is this we that begins interpret itself as a species or as a geological force? It is obvious that humans as animal species or a geological force cannot blame themselves for what has been done. So there is a certain intuition about our responsibility, what forces us to interpret the situation, not as a neutral geological process, but as a crisis, a catastrophe, or even the end of the world. So the direction of my presentation is towards this we humans. But the question of a new concept of humanity is too broad for one presentation. So I will limit myself to the aspect of waste in our everyday life in the Anthropocene. First, I will ask what is the structure of our relation to waste. For me, a phenological aspect will be important, so I will first ask about our experience of waste. We do not have solid ground or transcendental structures for this because our handling of waste has changed in different historical everyday practices. But I will try to identify some universal aspects in terms of the field of attention, social order, and everyday practices. I will then look at what is important for the Anthropocene. I treat the Anthropocene not so much as a term that transfers us from modernity to Anthropocene, to a completely different new perspective. Of course, there is a certain shift whose effect is the diversification of our everyday experience. The scale framing of experience is our condition of everyday life in the Anthropocene. I will explore how it diversified disrupts or problematizes our relationship with waste. It will be an important aspect of deep time. Notions of deep time differ a lot in contemporary discourses. I fully agree with Ted Todwine on what is important in this regard. I read his new book, Memory of Revolt, with great pleasure. As he says, what makes the Anthropocene proposal significant for our purposes is the temporal logic involved, namely the interpretation and management of a presence by means of speculative fantasies about the deep past and far future. So, for me, the deep time is not so much important as a geological time, and I don't have time to analyze different notions and interpretation. So, deep time is important to me as a challenge to our imagination, as a proposition of new time scale for measuring our present everyday decisions, actions, and interpretation. I will try to name some challenges of our time in terms of the environmental crisis, the global imaginary, the scale framing of everyday life, and responsibility. The phenological aspect will be important for me, and finally I will return to the question of human and will analyze what is the relationship between we and I, and how we can take responsibility not on a global but on a very personal level facing our waste and other forms of life. So let's go to dar viena paspausta. So it will be two aspects, constitution of waste in everyday practice and philosophical response to the challenges of Anthropocene. I want to start let's go to waste Anthropocene with a phenomenological aspect. I want to start not with the global things, global pollution, which can pretend to be most important marker of the Anthropocene, but with everyday behavior, which seems completely insignificant from a geological point of view. Let's start with the question, how something becomes waste? What everyday practice is discarding? If you are not follower of the zero waste movement, discarding may seem very simple. The Lithuanian philosopher Arūnas Svirdalas, describes the simplicity of littering consciousness in a very short, ironic and moralistic way. He suggests to imagine a situation with nice Lithuanian people relaxing by the lake, beginning of quote. It seems that a most regular everyman, on having drank the last sip of his yogurt, beer, champagne or vodka, and having smoked the last of his cigarettes at very moment, completely spontaneously and unaware of his own actions, launch a bottle or a packet out of his hand because it has just become useless. The Zuhandenheit of the packets or its readiness to hands is very narrow and episodic. The trajectory of its movement takes a very limited room of space, while beyond it is the horizon of complete uncertainty. The empty containers slipping out of one's fingers simply disappear from the field of attention, and that is that. So, end of quote. This text was written 20 years ago, and I am happy that our daily behavior has changed today. Today we think about sorting waste, recycling, circular economy, how to turn waste into resource, and so on. And this example may seem like something totally responsible and even stupid, but let not to be quick to judge. It may seem that such behavior is creating a mess. but it is a way of keeping order and an example of how people organize their living space. Here we see only one aspect of the field of attention. The field of attention is very narrow and episodic, so the space of order is limited within it. Outside this field is not my space of order. And here we can see the first condition of discarding. To paraphrase Mary Douglas, for this kind of consciousness, waste is a matter out of place. Waste must be pushed out of our field of attention, and this also requires a kind of forgetting. This example shows the common structure use, discard, forget. If we think about everyday practices, we keep order in our living spaces in a very similar way. Trash cans, garbage dumps outside, landfills helps us stay in the use, discard, forget structure. If we tend to organize our everyday life according to such a scheme, the difference is only in the scope of attention, in the scope of my space of order. Thus, throwing away may seem like an insignificant action, but even the consciousness of throwing away is rooted in the deeper layer of how we organize our living space, how we form our evaluative landscape. As Guy Hawkins shows in his book Ethics of Waste, it is a matter of practices of the self. Beginning of quote, waste constitutes the self in the habits and embodied practices through which we decide what is connected to us and what isn't. Managing its biological and material reality is part of the way in which we organize ourselves and our environment, keep chaos at bay. This is why styles of waste disposal are also styles of self, and why waste management in all its cultural mutations is fundamental to the practice of subjectivity. It is a part of way in which we cultivate sensibilities and sensual relations with the world. Part of the way we move things out of our life and impose ethical and aesthetical order. No matter how insignificant putting out the garbage may seem, the way we do it reflects an ethos, a manner of being. So, end of quote. So, discarding is not simply getting rid of unwanted things, it is a part of order, a practice of the self, it is an ethos and a way of being. Mary Douglas, was one of the first to show that waste and dirt require a system. As she said, where there is dirt, there is system. Of course, we cannot identify dirt and waste. To discuss this difference would be another story. I just note that for Douglas, dirt was a constitutive part of symbolic order, purity and danger. Pushing the dirt out of place through purification rituals is maintaining or restoring orders. For us, moderns, in Douglas' words, waste is a matter of out of place and also is a matter of hygiene, ethics, and aesthetics. And in our experience, the materiality of waste is more important than its symbolic meaning. But I want to show some common tendencies, only two, creativity and kind of forgetting or kind of blindness. Both Douglas emphasize a moment of creativity in keeping order through purification. Tommy? As Douglas says, in chasing dirt, in papering, decorating, tidying, we are not governed by anxiety to escape disease, but are positively reordering our environment, making conform to an idea. There is nothing fearful or unreasoning in our dirt avoidance. It is a creative moment, an attempt to relate form to function, to make unity of experience. So we see that removing dirt is not an insignificant habit, but has a creative moment. It restores order, creates unity of experience, and thus puts the world back in order. Hawkins echoes Douglas' insights, emphasizing moments of pleasure, constitution of a self, and mastery of place. As he says, as Mary Douglas shows us, garbage is pleasurable. The habits of cleansing and expelling do great service to identity. They make us feel momentarily whole. The boundary between me and not me is absolutely clear. Rituals of purity and impurity creates unity of experience. And the second quote, after all, disposal is a kind of purification ritual that restores us to an ordered state, that its function and its pleasure. Framing things as rubbish doesn't just help us eliminate things from our lives. It also helps us experience the fantasy of self-sovereignty and ontological separateness. In order to be able to reject, we have to convert objects into worthless rubbish, simply meeting its fate. The end of quote. Stop, just not yet. So here we see the aspect of creativity. We organize the living place not only by creating the horizon of meaning, but also by pushing the unwanted things beyond the horizon. Self-sovereignty and ontological separateness may be sheer fantasy, but it is the field of meaning that structure our living place. And here we can move to the second aspect. This purification requires a kind of forgetting, a kind of blindness. Next, as Hawkins says, as one of our most everyday habits, disposal depends on a particular kind of blindness that helps us not see, not acknowledge the things we want to be free of. To throw things away is to subordinate objects to human action. It is to construct a world in which we think we have dominion. So we see that maintaining order requires not only control, but a certain kind of blindness. It is important to know that this blindness is not only an individual practice, it is also supported by institutions. We have a whole infrastructure for forgetting the waste, for letting it rot silently in landfills, or for storing in containers in remote places. Individual habits are interdependent with social institutions. For example, Hawkins notes that the privatization of human waste is only possible after the construction of public infrastructure such as sewers. Only under these conditions we can release human waste into the most private place, the bathroom. The modernity thinker Anthony Giddens shows how modern institutions maintain order and this kind of blindness. For order is control, for blindness is the sequestering of experience. Control based on reflexivity and disembedding tends to be total. It encompasses space and time through the colonization of future, through the calculation and management of risk. Of course, we see that in the Anthropocene, this control has become very questionable. I will return to this question later. In the context of discard, a second aspect is more interesting, the sequestration of experience. As Giddens says, the term sequestration of experience refers here to the connected processes of concealment which set apart the routines of ordinary life from the following phenomena: madness, criminality, sickness and death, sexuality and nature. End of quote. Thus, everyday experience is ontologically secure when it is isolated from the unknown, threatening processes that challenge the order of everyday life. According to Giddens, sequestration of experience and everyday security is provided by institutions that isolate elements of potential threats in asylums, prisons, and funeral homes. Waste is also taken to the place that are physically difficult to access. It is a special effort to get to a landfill or to think about the release of toxic chemical in landfill at the dinner table. Everyday life tends to be a comfortable routine in which waste continue to exist as discarded, unwanted things. And I think that we have to pay attention to the sequestration of experience because first, today it has great institutional support under the keeper order of in our everyday living places. Second, it is confronted with education about environmental issues. And third, it remains as the creation of security when people feel despair and tend to forget or prefer not to see not only waste, but also all environmental issues. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that the Anthropocene shatters control, sequestration, and practices of blindness, and we are forced to change our everyday life. So let's move to the challenges of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene, with the emergence of a global imaginary, shows that we can practice with blindness only under the condition that we have limited consumption, that we have enough space outside our place of order to put our waste, and that this waste is not lethal for us as other forms of and for other forms of life. The Anthropocene marks a certain shift. The lethality and accumulation of waste, its not decomposability, do not allow us to practice forgetting and blindness. Especially such dangerous and lethal waste as chemical, nuclear waste cannot be pushed out of our space of order. It has to be always under control. So it deprives us of our ease of forgetting and condemns us to vigilance, even to a certain kind of insomnia. We and many generations after us will have to deal with this waste. From a phenological point of view focused on everyday life, the Anthropocene shift means that we have to pay more attention to the materiality of things than to their meaning. In the early 20th century, Martin Heidegger's example of a hammer worked as a demonstration of the structure of experience. We pay attention to the meaning of the hammer, and the better we use the hammer, the better we understand its readiness to hand. Its materiality, according to Heidegger, only comes into the field of attention when it breaks. I think we can take this as a metaphor for Anthropocene shift. Now we look at the things not through the lens of a working hammer, but through the lens of a broken hammer. We must pay more attention to the materiality of things than to their meaning and functionality. The waste of the Anthropocene pulls out of blindness and focuses to be vigilant. Of course, to talk about challenges of the Anthropocene is too much for one talk, so I will touch only few aspects which are important for our relation with waste. There is environmental crisis, global imaginary and deep time, scale framing of everyday life, and responsibility. So let's start with environmental crisis. That we live in the environmental crisis seems to be self-evident. In public discourses, there are many representations of it. Great Pacific garbage patch, pollutant places, extinction of species, and so on. If you look at the definitions of the Anthropocene, proposed by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, you can see that these changes are not presented as neutral geological processes, but in terms of perturbation, loss, erosion, extinction, and pollution. Why are technofossils a sign of crisis, but not neutral new elements? Of course, it is an important question whether we have to think of environmental issues in terms of crisis or in terms of change. But it would be Latourian story. The aspect of waste focuses our attention to materiality and consequences of human activity. There are important material consequences of growing population and consumption, as well as our imagination of this process are as dangerous as crisis, even as the end of the world. Consequences are represented on many scales. For example, calculation of anthropogenic mass or biomass of mammals in the whole world. You can see how far the biomass of humans and domesticated animals exceed the biomass of wild animals. Also, you can see that by 2020, according to some calculation, the amount of anthropogenic mass exceeded the weight of all global living biomass. I understand that we cannot take such calculation for granted, that each calculation has certain preconditions, and that we can question whether these data are exact or correct. But looking at such calculation, it is impossible to deny that humanity has indeed become a dominant species that can deplete, devastate, and pollute on a global scale. But for me, such calculations are important not as a representation of facts, but as an indication or a shift in self-awareness. How this crisis has changed our self-awareness. There is a difference between the self-awareness of modernity and self-awareness of Anthropocene. People of modernity identify themselves through their cultural capacities: religion, art, science, education, and so on. Discourses on human essence in phenomenological philosophy of the 20th century, for example, Schiller, Heidegger, Fink, partly repeat arguments on human essence formulated in the Enlightenment. But the self-awareness of the Anthropocene identifies itself through unintended consequences, through the byproducts and leftover, consuming, pollution, waste, resource depletion, species extinction, and so on. So instead of human as the most developed creature, the end of evolution, the most capable being, we have the culprit, accomplice of doing bad things. There is a certain irony in the fact that we have, after all, created eternal things, nuclear waste, epic waste, in words of Nicolas and Basil. But now we treat it not as a manifestation of power, but as the ultimate danger and feeling guilty. It is not so only a technological challenge, it is a challenge to our self-awareness. So let's go to global imaginary and deep time. The shift of Anthropocene is marked by emergence of global imaginary. It is important from a phenological point of view. It provides the scale on basis of hyper-connectedness. Discourses on globalization have shown how closely our political and economical events of local everyday life are connected to global processes. Now we understand more deeply the consequences of our everyday habits. Every time we eat, wash, clean, take medicine, turn on electrical appliances, and so on, you have global consequences. Many insignificant processes become significant when they accumulate. The global imaginary provides a new scale for measuring our everyday habits. There are significant changes in the aspect of place. With the local imaginary, you can think of waste as something out of place. You or institutions take it to remote places, and you can forget about it. But with the emergence of the global imaginary and the understanding of hyperconnectedness, there is no outside. So cleaning my room cannot be as pleasurable as creating order and unity of experience, because the global imaginary shows that our cleaning is pollution of other places. From a phenological point of view, we can notice that it also changes in our relationship to place, time, and things. We can mark the emergence of new consciousness that interprets things through the lens of a broken hammer, drawing attention not so much to functionality of things as to their materiality and decomposability. The best representative is Bea Johnson, pioneer of zero waste movement. For example, her relationship with waste. The first step is to decide whether waste is a matter out of place. It's a quote, you cannot see the whole quote. We drag the trash can to the curb at night, and by the time we get up the next morning, the cereal liners and dirty paper towels have disappeared as if by magic. But when we say we threw something away, what do you really mean? Away may take trash out of our sight, but that doesn't mean it should be out of our mind. After all, our discards don't just evaporate because the garbage man whisked them off. So she has no away or out of place. She never takes trash out of her mind. It is an example of the refusal to forget the garbage. It witnessed new forms of vigilance. For the new consciousness, the act of throwing away the trash is no longer obvious, since everything is interpreted in terms of resistance, accumulation, recyclability, and possible trajectories of movement. Her book, Zero Waste Home, shows how all things and activities, school, work, leisure, holidays, entertainment, and games, can be reinterpreted from the point of waste. It is through this scale that we must evaluate our daily habit, choices, and values. The new pyramid of needs based on 5R, refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, rot, shows a new value system. But living this way is not easy. Bea Johnson admitted that she found it difficult to be very consistent, and I like ask my students if they have tried to live a zero-waste lifestyle. Most of them say that they are very sympathetic to this movement and agree that such a way of dealing with waste is very important, but they also say that it is too hard and too depressing to live such a lifestyle, and that they are trying to find another not so radical way of dealing with waste. So from the point of view of the global imaginary, Johnson remains very limited because the focus of her attention is only on everyday habits and the wastefulness of things. It represents personal vigilance. The Anthropocene offers more time scales and phases with more global and epic waste, so such lethal waste as chemical or nuclear waste requires institutional vigilance. I find very important Nicolas and Basil idea. You can recognize these people. Nicolas and Basil's in Ignalina nuclear plant, and this is a plant for storage waste requires eternal vigilance of human institutions. We have only vague ideas about how humanity will live and manage its life in 50 or 100,000 years, but we have a very concrete task to keep nuclear waste safe. And here we are in very ambivalent relationship with time if we think of the Anthropocene as a shift from modernity. Many thinkers of Anthropocene emphasizes the loss of control. I keep in mind Alan Bayan-Sarevich's book, Techno-Human Condition, also Timothy Clark's book. And here we thought that control is the keystone of modernity. And it seems that we have irretrievably lost control because of unpredictable new nature, climate change, and social institutions. We see that we have no way to eternal peace in Kant's notion, and as Alan Bayan-Sarevich show, we cannot control our own technologies. So we see that we cannot make reality conform to our ideas in terms of Douglas, but reality demands that we conform to its lethality. So we can try to escape modernity with Latour, Haraway, and think that we can start to live on unpredictable but life Gaia. But nuclear waste requires control and to be modern for far future, beyond possibility to colonize the future with imagination of modernity. Deep time opens a different scale of imagination without possibility to imagine such a future which can be managed by possible scenarios and calculations of risk. That's why the vastness of time on the temporal sublime is so uncanny and frightening to our consciousness. Here come to the challenge of deep time. So for me, deep time is important not as a geological time beyond our limited experience, but as a challenge of the imagination. I fully agree with Ted's insight that such a time scale is important as a mean of managing our present, and also that deep time can come into our experience in many forms. Of course, we have to acknowledge that with the notion of deep time, we are trying to grasp something that is beyond our experience, but also something on which we depend. We can try to grasp with a new materialism as ancestral time, with Chakrabarti as a geological time, which remains indifferent to human experience. I do not want to deny such a possibility of time, but for me it's more important how deep time affects our imagination and how it is recognizable in our experience. So I have read with great pleasure the chapters of Ted's book on how we can grasp deep time as immemorial past, as an evolutionary past in our natural body. I will really follow this way of thinking about animality. Animality is also my theme. I'm very interested in it. I think it is a very promising way. But in this context, there is a question. Can we apply this to relation with waste? Perhaps there is something in common. Of course, we can say that every living being produces some waste. Next slide. Even protoplasm such as amoeba and infusories, which served as representative of principle of life for Uexküll and Heidegger, produces natural waste. You can see amoeba. They also produce waste. Perhaps not only possibility of giving matter a framework in Uexküll's word, or Heidegger's Fähigsein is the only principle. Perhaps the production of waste can be included in the principle of life. Perhaps no living being can live not only without forming, creating, digesting, but also without wasting, without expelling its waste from the body or from the field of action. We can talk about social order and that dirt is constituted only in relation to social order, but perhaps dirt and waste can be constituted in relation to the order of life. And the structure of use, discard, forget is not only human. Maybe we can question or try to eliminate the anthropological difference not only on the ground of intercorporeality and interanimality, but also on the ground of interability to waste. Okay, I find this a little bit provoking and weak. So I prefer to leave this question as question because I understand that to make such statements about the essence of human or animal is to repeat the Heideggerian story. Maybe we can answer it only in a metaphysical way, following the steps of Uexküll and Heidegger. So let's go to scale framing in everyday life. The global imaginary provides many scales by which we can measure our everyday activities. That creates some confusion and makes everyday life in the Anthropocene more difficult. These scales are not neutral. We evaluate our action with different scales, and depending on the scale, my action can be good or bad, purifying or polluting, and so on. For example, when I clean my house, I use different chemical cleaners, take different waste outside my house and dustbin, and so on. I am doing the right and good thing by cleaning the house. It is on local scale, but if you think on global scale, I am doing harm. Many detergents are poisonous to water system, my garbage goes to landfill, so I am an accomplice in global pollution. That is the difficulty, the trouble of living in the Anthropocene. On the one hand, we have no stable system to evaluate our action. On the other hand, we are always forced to choose the scales. Hawkins has noted that the habits of cleaning and expelling do great service to identity. They make us feel momentarily whole, create unity of experience, help us experience self-sovereignty and tautological separateness. But this is possible when there are clear boundaries between our place of order and what is outside. But if we have no outside, can we feel unity of experience, self-sovereignty, and ontological separateness? I think we can in a certain sense, but we have to recognize the problem. I think the difficulty of the Anthropocene with global imaginary is not that all boundaries is lost, and we live in total confusion, but that we live between different scales, and it is not always clear which scale to choose. For example, I'm going to workshop in the USA. It is very worthy thing, but the carbon dioxide emission is more than 1,000 kilograms. It was written on our tickets. So what I should prioritize? So we have to find not only an Aristotelian golden mean on the one scale, but we have to find the golden mean between different scales. And the last point, our shallow responsibility. I think the question of responsibility is the most important one, but also the most difficult. Scale framing of everyday life shakes and shifts our boundaries, and the scope of my responsibility becomes vague. Compared to the vastness of deep time, my responsibility seems very shallow. I am a finite human being, so how can I save the world? My possibilities to act and improve the situation cannot go so deep into the time scale or encompass on the global scale. The Anthropocene forces us to think less about the content and more about the scope of our responsibility. In his book, The Just, Paul Ricoeur asks, how far in space and time does responsibility for our actions extend? The usual answer is, in terms of scope, its scope, responsibility extends as far as our powers do in space and time. But Ricoeur points out that there is a difference between the power to do something positive and the power to do harm. This distinction is very important in the context of the Anthropocene when we feel the extension of human responsibility. We have seen that the markers of the Anthropocene were mostly signs and remnants of harmful human activity. And then we observe how different countries deal with climate change, how deep is the inability to achieve international climate agreements, and even more difficult to comply with these agreements. We see that the positive power to do something in this direction is significantly lower compared to the ability to do harm. And this ability to do harm is not so active intentional. The harms of the Anthropocene, pollution, waste, carbon dioxide emission, ocean acidification, and the like, passive remnants of human activity, unintended consequences when many insignificant events, such as throwing trash in the trash can, cleaning room, driving car, and so on, come together, accumulate, and form new globally significant processes. Can we be responsible for this? As Ricoeur says, our responsibility for the harm done extend as far as our capacity to do harm. So in the Anthropocene, our responsibility, collective and personal, extends not to the dimension of doing something or acting or managing, but to the dimension of doing harm. Humanity is coming to interpret itself not through the lens of power and capability, but through the lens of culpability. Of course, it is a very broad topic, and we can talk about the extension of responsibility from Hans Jonas Georg Picht to contemporary environmental ethics. I can only take some aspects. I want to come back to the question of how we relate to waste from a phenological point of view. I also want to return to the question of anthropological difference. In many discourses about how we humans have harmed the planet, we, and humanity are treated as something in one, as a unity. Is there a reason for this identification? It seems that connection between me as a rational person and the stupid, consuming, polluting species is very weak. The Anthropocene popular notions of humanity as a species and as a geological force give reason to break this bond. As a geological force, humanity has no responsibility. It only participates in geological processes as a matter of sedimentation. As a species among other species, it cannot take responsibility for global processes as well. And even there is a question whether we can experience myself as a species. As Dipesh Chakrabarty says, we humans never experience ourselves as a species. There could be no phenomenology of us as a species. He thinks that we can only emotionally identify ourselves with humanity, but species as such is something very abstract. And when we think about how the planetary is indifferent to us humans, he misses some points that evoke responsibility and experience us as humans. I think that my responsibility as a human doesn't arise in the relationship between me and the planet, but it is evoked in the encounter with other forms of life as living beings on the same planet. Edward Casey, in the book that Ted edited, he had described the complexity of environmental trauma in a very poetic way. Unfortunately, I do not have time to go deeper into this interpretation, but the keystone there was the Levinasian notion of the encounter with the suffering other. I think that this experience of encounter can be a phenomenological guide to interpret my responsibility as a human being. Of course, in Casey's case, there is the encounter with a clear-cut forest, and there was no reference to waste. But I think waste can provide other forms of experience of environmental trauma. And what we experience when we encounter birds, mammals, contaminated plants stuck in oil on a seashore. What do we experience when we encounter seals and turtles entangled in nets or birds stuck in plastic bag? Animals covered in oil or entangled in plastic show that waste of human activity not only pollutes but also kills other living beings and destroys the environment. The animal's inability to escape its suffering strikes me as an appeal to do something. Traces of harmful human activity motivate not only to respond personally to the appeal of the animals, but also direct back to humankind. Here I experience that people have left waste and polluted, damaged environment. I realized that the damage was caused by none other than people. Someone else did the wasteful action. The pollution or garbage is not mine, but I, as a human being, become a polluter's accomplice. For example, we can imagine the situation if you find a bird entangled in tree branches, maybe we feel pity, but that's a life of nature. And yet, if you find an animal entangled in plastic, although that is also its fate, I accept it as a human fault in which I am complicit. By freeing an animal from the branches around it, I'm happy that I made part in making its natural life a little bit easier. But by freeing it from plastic, I can only feel reserved happiness that I have compensated a little for the damage caused by human pollution. A discarded plastic bag or other waste that kills animals or destroys the environment is a trace of human. I understand and experience rescue of an entangled animal not only as a struggle for the animal life, but also as a struggle against the effects of humanity. And here I am, no longer acting as a species or a geological force, but as a responsible and self-aware human, responsible to the environment, nature, and animal. I think that such Levinasian encounter with environmental trauma can take many forms. When we think of pollution and of slow disaster, it can expand in time or even more forms. I have given only one striking example. Interpreting the variety of trauma will be a longer story. And so the last, I have no time for conclusions. I understand that there are many things to explain and discuss that my talk appear quite dense. It is a work in progress, so my conclusions are not completely finished. I just share a few remarks. We see that the Anthropocene, with its new time scales, provides new measures for everyday action for self and humanity. We see how our relationship to waste, the ease with which we throw it away, can turn into environmental trauma. We see how garbage, as unwanted matter out of place, can become the bond between human and animal or environment. We can meet not only face-to-face without mediation, but through a mediation of waste. And waste gives a new dimension to the Levinasian "you shall not kill." The encounter between I and others is not only an interpersonal relationship, it becomes the relationship between humanity and the environment. Perhaps in such an encounter, the anthropological difference, instead of being the ground of human exceptionalism, instead of being the difference of essence, Wesensunterschied, in the words of Schiller and Heidegger, can become the difference of responsibility. Perhaps we are not the most capable being, but the most responsible for our waste. Perhaps maybe then to be a human in the Anthropocene means to be able to respond to the appeal of the environment and take care of our own waste. Thank you for attention.